If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Luke. This is where we will spend our time. Ed, that purse goes with your shirt.
It does.
Before we start today, I want to just give a little preamble to this, and I hope this will be something you can keep in mind as we go through this today. When we read the Gospels, two things. One, we're reading a Jewish document, and that's something that we don't think about very much when we're reading them, that they're Jewish. These are Jewish writers writing about a Jewish Messiah from a Jewish point of view. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I know we don't capture, and that is these things that Jesus is saying to these crowds, they are completely shocking to them. We're so used to it. We've been reading our gospel since we were children, some of us. Been in Sunday school, we've heard all these things. So for us, the shock value does not exist. We just don't see it. And yet for these people in this day in which Jesus is speaking these things to them, these things were completely shocking to them. And so I hope that somehow as we look at this text, especially this one today, that we can capture the shock value of what Jesus is saying. And another thing I'd like for us to consider, when we read a text like this we're going to read today, we are reading of heavenly things. These aren't things that we know of in the earth. They're not things that we are acquainted with that happen in the world normally. And they give us a physical evidence of God's providence. That is, as He makes His plans for how the universe is going to go, these are the evidences that we look for. And it's hard to capture this in our minds. Scholars look at this text. This is called the Olivet Discourse. Jesus standing on the Mount of Olives giving this teaching. And it's debated and written about in theological circles now for centuries. G.K. Chesterton said something I think that really captures the feeling of this kind of text. He said, only the fool tries to get the heavens inside his or her head. And it's not surprising that if you try it, your head bursts. And I think that's right. He says the wise are content to get their head inside the heavens. So I think let's attempt to do that as we look at this text today. I'll begin reading in verse 5 of chapter 21. It's a long reading, so I apologize for that, but if you'd like to follow along, please feel free. Now, while some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and offerings, Jesus said, these things you are looking at, the days will come when not one stone will be left standing upon another. All will be torn down. So they said to him, Teacher, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that these things are about to take place? Jesus said, Watch out that you're not misled. Many will come in my name saying, I am, and that the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and rebellions, don't be afraid. These things must happen, but the end will not come all at once. Then he said to the people listening to him, Nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, famines, plagues in various places, terrifying sights and great signs from heaven. Before all of this, they will seize you and persecute you and hand you over to the synagogues and the prisons. You'll be brought before kings and governors in my name. This will be a time for you to serve as a witness for me. Therefore be resolved not to rehearse ahead of time how you will make your defense in front of the kings and rulers. I will give you the words along with the wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You'll be betrayed by parents, brothers, sisters, relatives, friends. Some of them will have you put to death. You'll be hated by everyone because of my name, yet not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that the desolation has come near. Then those who are in Judea should flee to the mountains. Those who are inside the city must depart. Those who are outside the country and outside the city must not enter it, because these days are days of vengeance, and all that is written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing their babies in those days. There will be great distress on the earth and wrath against all this people. They'll fall by the edge of the sword. They'll be led away as captives among all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, if you were a Jewish person standing in that audience that day, this was unthinkable. This was absolutely unthinkable. Now, there are 4 movements in this passage, 4 distinct things that Jesus speaks about. So let's just take each one of them and look at them for a brief moment. The first one is a Jewish concept, and it's called in the Old Testament the Day of the Lord. The Day of the Lord. Jewish eschatology, that is, eschatology is a big 50-cent word that just means the times that are to come, the end times, the revealing of things that are going to happen. It had 2 movements, 2 eras. One was the era in which we are now living, the present age, as the Jews called it. And this age was fit for destruction. That's how the Jews saw this present time. It was to be done away with, everything in it. The second age was the age to come, and that is the age when there would be a restoration. If you look at Isaiah chapter 11, he talks about lions laying down with lambs, children playing at cobras' dens. There'll be all the relationships in the earth will be completely healed. That's the age to come. And this idea of the coming day of the Lord was prophesied by the prophets as a terrible, terrible day for everybody. It says this, the Lord's day of judgment is coming. It's a day of cruelty and savagery, raging anger, destroying the earth and annihilating the sinners. That's a terrible day. I remember when I was working in Maryland, and I remember, those of you who've been here a long time, you remember the 5 Bobs. We had 5 Bobs on the job in Maryland. And so we had a different name for every Bob. There was Bob, then there was Bob, then there was Rob, then there was Bob, and then there was Big Bob. And that's how we told everybody apart. That's the only, there were so many Bobs. Hey Bob, and 4 people look up, you've got to differentiate. So you say Bob Rob, and he knew who he was. Well, I got off with Bob, the original Bob, one day, and we were working, and there was nobody else around us. We were debolting a form way down in a hole, 30 feet underwater, but the water was pumped out. So we were down in this hole debolting this form, and Bob, I had just become a believer. I'd been a believer for maybe 2 weeks. What do I know? I don't know anything, except I'm a believer now, so... Bob, and he was serious. Normally, if there were people around us, Bob would make fun of me once he learned that I was a believer. But he was by himself. And he said, Rip, I've heard things about the coming of the end of the world. All these terrible things happening. Do you believe that stuff's going to happen? I said, I don't know much about it, but I do. He was deadly serious. He was quietly asking me about what the Bible talks about when it says things like the earth will be shattered in a great heat, and there'll be a great darkness, and the stars will no longer shine. The moon will be darkened. All of these terrible things, that the sky being the eastern sky rolling back as a scroll, whatever that means. There's one thing, I don't know a lot about it to this day. I could take you to a seminary library and take you to a stack of books this tall, on any seminary in America, or around the world for that matter, a stack of books this tall, and they will all disagree about what these events will look like and how they're going to happen and when they're going to happen and whether we'll be here or not be here. I know one thing for sure. For sure. Wolf Blitzer and CNN will not be necessary for us to know that something like this is happening. We're going to know. Everybody's going to know. It's not going to be something where we have to worry about it. And every Jewish person in this crowd understood this in just this way. And they knew exactly what Jesus was talking about, and they accepted it as truth. Jesus is telling them things that are Jewish here. Then the second concept is different. This is a new concept that Jesus is talking about called the fall of Jerusalem. 66 AD, and really about 20 years prior to that, there had been a lot of trouble between the Romans and the Jews in Judea. And it culminated in 66 AD with the beginning of armed conflict. That armed conflict went on through 73 AD. In 70 AD, General Titus was commissioned by the Roman emperor to go and quell the rebellion entirely. He's actually commissioned 2 years before that. He laid siege to Jerusalem, built an earthen wall all around it, cut off the entire city from all of its food supply. They had water because of Hezekiah's tunnel, but they had no food. Josephus records the events there such that there was cannibalism taking place inside the city walls because they had nothing to eat, nothing. They ate all the animals that were in there, and now there are no more animals. So there were literally dead bodies, and people were cooking other human beings in order to survive. Josephus says 1 million died. Now, we don't know if that number is accurate. Could have been less. Probably was less, but let's just say, who cares? I mean, when you get into numbers like that, that's a lot of people. He also says that 70,000 were led captive by the Romans into slavery. Just exactly what Jesus said here. You'll fall by the sword, and many will be led captive. The temple was burned. All the wooden and cloth and tapestry and everything that could burn was burned, and then the temple was dismantled stone by stone, just like Jesus said in 70 AD. And think of this, we can't capture this, that ended temple life for the Jews till right now. They still don't have it. There is no temple. There are no temple sacrifices. There are no Shekinah glory. You remember 600 years prior to this, God had left the temple. Back reading Ezekiel, I forget which chapter it is off the top of my head, but Ezekiel mentions the fact that God has left the temple. That was 600 years before this happened. The third concept, the return of the Messiah. This is another concept that the Jews would be familiar with. Jesus talks about it. The Old Testament day of the Lord that I spoke about a minute ago is tied to this. And Jesus warns them and says a lot of people are going to come and say, in the Greek it says this, I am, which is the name for God Almighty, taken out of the Septuagint. Out of the Greek Old Testament, Jesus is saying there are going to be people who are going to claim to be the Messiah. The Jews understood Messiah to share in God's nature in that way. So the I am literally is now come flesh and is dwelling among us, just what the word Emmanuel means. Jesus says there are going to be a lot of people who are going to come and claim that. Don't listen to them, don't follow them. And that there would be a lot of upheavals around taking place, all kinds of things taking place during that time, just what he mentions here. Then the fourth concept is that persecution would come to everybody who's a follower of God. Everybody who listens to Jesus, who listens to the Lord, who takes their Old Testament and believes it, they're going to be persecuted. Well, the church has been persecuted now for 2,000 years since that very day. Nothing has changed. So that gives you the lay of the land in this passage. We understand now where this passage is going. Jesus has won his debates with all of his antagonists. He's triumphantly entered into Jerusalem on the donkey colt. He's left the temple and now he's on Mount Olivet, giving his discourse, his last public address before he's going to be arrested and taken off to be crucified. But the Jews, as they listened to him, Jesus got in trouble one time for saying this about the temple. Jesus said, destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up. And they thought, this temple's been worked on for 46 years. You're going to tear it down and going to raise it up in 1 day? In 3 days? Who are you? They didn't understand what he meant. And in this case, he's talking about the physical temple. Well, 46 years, when Jesus says these words, they're still working on it. They're still working on the temple. Josephus talks about the temple. He says, if you came to the temple from a great distance and saw it, the marble was so white and the gold, all the gold appointments on the front were so shiny that when the sun hit it, you couldn't look directly at it. It was like looking into the face of the sun. It was one of the wonders of the world. And yet, Josephus, he talks about the stones that are in front of it. They're the size of railroad boxcars. This is a serious building. If we saw the building today, we would think, wow, what a building. Well, you can understand why a Jew in that era would have thought that the destruction of such a building would just be unthinkable to them. They couldn't even understand it. When Titus's soldiers overran it, when they finally came in, they laid siege, they finally said, this is enough of this, we're coming in, and they came into the temple area to destroy it, burned it. The burning caused the gold to melt. And as the gold melted, the soldiers then picked through the stones of the temple. That's where it got torn down stone by stone, because they wanted to collect whatever gold they could that had affixed itself to the stones in being melted. The prophecy was so disturbing. If you go to Mark 13 and read this, the disciples want to pull Jesus off and have a private conversation about this. They can't believe this themselves. So here Jesus is on Mount Olivet, and he's talking about all these things. This mountain is the mountain where the Bible records he will return. Mount Olivet is where he's going to return. So what does this stuff mean for us today? Here we are, 2,000 years later. One of the great accusations that I get when I'm corresponding with atheists is 2,000 years, everything's still clicking along. I mean, where is your Jesus? Well, one thing's for sure we can learn from this text is that Jesus isn't setting a date here. The historian Will Durant says of the last 34 years of history, only 260 or so have been without warfare. Now, Jesus talks about wars and rumors of wars. Well, for 3,400 years, there have been wars and rumors of wars. Nothing has changed. There are wars going on all over the world right now. Many generations, not just this one. You know, one of the comments in our culture today, in the Christian culture, is how bad everything is. Oh, it's so bad. It's worse than it's ever been. No, it's not. Imagine living in Judea when Titus lays siege to Jerusalem and when he overruns the temple. Imagine you're inside there during the 2 years when you finally are starting to eat your relatives because you've got no food. If I were there, I'd think this is the worst it's ever been. Back 200 years before this, they thought it was the worst it had ever been. They thought that John Maccabee was the Messiah because of all the terrible things that were happening in Judea. In World War I, that war is called the war to end all wars, because it was the first time when you had killing en masse, where you could take a single person with a weapon and kill hundreds and hundreds of people all at once. Or you could drop a bomb from an airplane and kill hundreds of people all at once. That was the first time. Before that, everything had been almost like hand-to-hand combat. And people looked at World War I and said, this is it. This is the worst it's ever been. Jesus is coming back. World War II, they said it again. Throughout history, this has been going on since the time of the apostles. When the apostles wrote, Paul especially, he wrote and warned the various churches, there are people in your midst who are saying Jesus' return has already occurred. Don't listen to them. And they were saying that because from their point of view, it was the worst it had ever been. Think of this, just to give you a perspective. All right, Jesus is crucified around 30 AD. The resurrection takes place around 30 AD. From that time, within just two and a half decades, 3 decades, you have a huge earthquake in Laodicea where thousands were killed. You have Vesuvius, who overruns, kills everybody in Pompeii and Herculaneum. 2 cities are just wiped out by a volcanic eruption. There was a famine in the Roman Empire. Nobody knows how many people died from that. If you were living there during those decades right after Jesus' resurrection and you were a believer, what would you think? You would think this is the worst it has ever been. Look, what this all boils down to is this. I have so much conviction about this that I hesitate to speak in a tone that it all satisfies the conviction I have, so I won't do that. God is not asking us to be concerned about the end at all. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care how big the ministry is they've built on the basis of predicting the end. God is asking you and me to be concerned about what we do in the next 5 minutes. How are we living? How do we fit into now in our life? How do we fit into now in terms of how we treat each other and how we treat the people we say we love? How we treat everything, our personal integrity. What are we willing to lie about or hold back or not say accurately? I mean, all of this, how we handle everything. We looked last week at giving, how we handle our resources, how we handle our energy, how we handle our time, everything. God is not asking us to be concerned about how the future is going to shake out. He's asking us, what are we going to do? What constitutes the bulk of our living now? Right now. Right now is all we've got. The future's not here. The past is gone. This is a huge philosophical subject I won't get into right now with regard to time, but now is all we've got. Are we allowing God to use us to be salt and light? In other words, to be who we should be for other people right now. Think about it this way. There's a movie a few years back came out called The Bucket List. Everybody knows what a bucket list is, right? Do you know what that is? That's a whole list of things. You're getting to the last portion of your life and you're thinking, what things would I really like to try to do before I leave this world? There's an urgency about your life, and all of a sudden you're thinking, I'm on the tail end of the life I've been given, and now I want to make sure I do those things. Well, what's our bucket list? I'll tell you what, that bucket list says a lot about who we are before God. If our bucket list isn't consumed with living for Him, then maybe we need to look at the bucket list again and reconfigure it just a little bit. And God's going to take care of Jesus coming back without our supervision, I promise. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything, you've got a question for me, you want to